Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. By a show of hands, who here always knew what they wanted to be? When you turned 18, did you know the route you wanted to take or what you wanted to study? For some people, they have their whole life planned out, and for others, sometimes the journey takes a little longer. We are in Sacramento, California today to meet a young man named Nick Howard. Nick was 18 and had just graduated high school. Nick began working part-time with his dad at the auto repair shop that he had owned, while he continued to live at home to save money, while he decided whether or not he wanted to go to college or to do something else. He didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life, and that's totally okay. Not everybody knows what they want to do or want to be by the time they turn 18, and sometimes younger. And it's nice to see that his parents supported him in this way while he was figuring it out. Nick was a hard worker and always made his best effort at the repair shop. In his free time, he really enjoyed spending it with his friends from high school, and since they had all just recently graduated, they had the newfound sense of freedom of staying out later, since they didn't have to worry about it being a school night. Nick would often stay out late several days of the week and would return home very late at night. As long as it didn't interfere with his work the following morning or affect his future plans in any way, his parents were okay with it. On the night of February 5th, 1997, Nick had gone out to meet with his friend Tony. Before he made his way home, Nick had stopped at a restaurant in town to pick up his driver's license that he had accidentally left there earlier that evening. When he walked up to the door, he saw that it was closed for the night, so Nick left a handwritten note on the door saying that he had stopped by to pick up his driver's license that he had left there earlier, and for someone to just give him a call so he could come pick it up. Around midnight, Nick had called his parents and left a message on their machine saying that he was having some car trouble, but he was still on his way home and expected to be there around 12:30. But he never came home. Nick always returned home. Leaving the message on his parents' machine was his way of keeping them in the loop and notifying them of his whereabouts during these late hours. He would call and leave them a message telling them where he was, who he was with, and when he'd be home. And they'd always find him in his room the next morning. When his mom Patty looked in his room that morning, only to discover his unslept-in bed, she immediately knew something was wrong and called police to report Nick missing. The police first went to the restaurant where Nick had left his driver's license, since they knew he was definitely here the night before. The road that Nick would have had to have taken home from the restaurant notably had very poor visibility at night and at times was very windy. If you took your focus off the road for even a moment, you could easily swerve and roll down the embankment and end up in the Sacramento River. Nick was known to be a pretty safe driver, and he never drove under the influence. Of course, any number of factors might cause one to swerve off the road, like a deer or another car, or he might have just been really tired and possibly drifted just for a second. 2 days later, Nick's car was discovered by police, totally submerged in the river, and was indicated to have still had the engine running as it ran off the road. The car's gear shift was in the neutral position, and the windows had been partially rolled down. Interestingly, Nick was nowhere to be found, which was unusual for an accident such as this. After the car was examined by investigators, they found Nick's glasses on the passenger side floor, and they appeared that they were almost folded in half. Because the seatbelt was found to have not been buckled, and because the windows were found partially down, his family was extremely hopeful that Nick was able to escape from the car and swim to the shore. They expected to find him very soon. Upon further inspection of Nick's car, investigators found what appeared to be very oily, greasy film almost, all over the interior of his car. After being submerged and exposed to water for so long, the film turned almost a milky white color. Icky. It was soon discovered to be motor oil. This was later confirmed when an empty bottle of motor oil was found in Nick's trunk. It had appeared to have opened and spilled everywhere, either during or after the car's crash. Investigators then went back to the road to look for clues as to where the initial accident occurred. They thought that they might find tire treads or skid marks, which would let them know if he swerved or not, or was trying to stop and potentially lost control. They thought at first that Nick had possibly fallen asleep at the wheel. After all, it was after midnight and very dark in the area that he was in. It was noted, though, that typically, if someone were to fall asleep at the wheel, usually they end up being jolted awake and try to steady themselves, and this would lead to the tire skid marks being left on the road. When police went to the origin point of where the car would have entered the water, not one single mark was found on the road. All the investigators thought this was odd and certainly uncharacteristic of an accident like this. Having found nothing here, investigators then returned their efforts to the river, hoping to turn up possible clues about Nick's whereabouts. Since his glasses were found on the floor of his car, he was presumably disoriented, but was hopefully able to exit the car, swim to shore, and get help. A few days later, with more experts providing input on the accident, it was beginning to look like it might not have been an accident at all. An expert had found it odd that the car would have been found in the neutral position. It was initially thought that the car had been in drive and possibly knocked into the neutral position upon impact with the water, but since the car had a manual transmission and would require more effort to change gears, as opposed to an automatic car, which could change gears with nothing more than a little boop, so they determined that the car had been intentionally placed and left in neutral. When the hood was lifted, there was what appeared to be an oil bottle cap found on the carburetor, which had been holding the throttle open. The cap was then discovered to belong to the empty bottle of motor oil that was found in Nick's trunk. Very odd that it would be there, as if intentionally placed under the hood. It seemed to investigators that the car had been staged so that the bottle cap was there to hold the gas pedal in place, so that the car could have operated without having someone physically inside to press down on the pedal. They found that because the bottle cap was placed here, it would have gradually accelerated the speed of the car to 25 miles per hour until it swerved off the road and slid down the embankment. It lost speed and was going approximately 15 miles per hour when it hit the water, and at that point began submerging. Aside from Nick's glasses, no other personal effects were found in the car, but when they looked at them closer, they had a hard time believing that Nick was actually wearing them when the car crashed. The way in which they were bent and again almost folded in half, seemed unreasonable and unlikely to have occurred in the event that Nick crashed his car and they bent upon impact. Investigators ended up doing an experiment to see if his glasses could have actually become bent in this way after a crash. The glasses in the test showed very little damage, nothing more than a little minor ding. The results of these tests confirmed that it was impossible for his glasses to find themselves in this condition after being on Nick's face and having hit the steering wheel at 15 miles per hour when the car eventually crashed. They believe Nick's glasses had been planted. They were certainly not worn by Nick during the crash. They thought that if Nick had not been in the car during the crash, he was most likely alive, but where was he? They continued their search of the water, never losing hope. However, 10 days later, a search crew found a body in the Clarksburg River, just a quarter-mile away from where Nick's car was found. Dental records confirmed that this was in fact Nick Howard. The condition of his body led investigators to believe that he was primarily underwater during this time before resurfacing. Further confirmation that Nick was not in his car when it crashed. Nick was found completely free of oil, whereas the interior of his car was completely covered. During Nick's autopsy, the medical examiner discovered that he had several internal and external injuries consistent with being beaten. He found evidence in several places of internal bleeding and evidence of strap muscle hemorrhaging, which is internal bleeding in his neck muscles. The medical examiner found this specific injury to be consistent with strangulation, something you certainly wouldn't get during a car accident. On Nick's face, there were several bruises and abrasions in different stages of healing, as well as several indications of blunt force trauma. He also found water inside Nick's lungs, which meant he was still breathing when he entered the water. Ultimately, the medical examiner determined his cause of death was drowning, as he was experiencing a lack of oxygen and possibly went unconscious upon entering the water. Because of Nick's injuries and the manner in which he died, his death was ruled a homicide. On the night of Nick's disappearance and suspected death, he had apparently made 2 phone calls. One of those calls was to his sister, and it went straight to voicemail. He left her a message saying that he was having car trouble, but expected to be home within half an hour. He also made a call to his friend Sam, saying the same thing. He said that he was having car trouble and that he had tried getting in contact with his sister. He told Sam that he was tired because he had been awake for 32 hours and his car was having an issue keeping the distributor cap on, but he was able to fix it. This made investigators wonder if the car trouble story might have been a cover or had anything to do with the way in which he died. When police began investigating this as a homicide, they first questioned Nick's family. They wanted to know if anyone would have financially benefited from his death. It was then discovered that Nick had several very large life insurance policies totaling almost $1 million, which seems suspicious for an 18-year-old who didn't have any dependents. One of the policies in particular had an $850,000 payout specifically in the event that Nick died in an accident, which he did. Police were eager to find out who the beneficiaries were, since they felt whoever they were, They would have motive since they had the most to gain. Nick's family had initially believed that they were the beneficiaries, as they had no reason to believe otherwise. However, when his mother looked at the policies in his room, she discovered an extra form that was an application to change the beneficiary. It was a copy of a crumpled up paper that had been smoothed out. The beneficiary was listed as a man named Ralph Marcus. Nick's mother, Patty, was shocked. She had first met Ralph more than 20 years ago while they were in high school. Ralph was a few years older than Patty, so they never were in the same class, but Ralph was always hanging around Patty's circle of friends. At one point, when they were teenagers, Ralph was at Patty's house and had wrestled her to the floor and tried to kiss her as she fought him off. Ralph had always been infatuated with Patty, at one point proposing to her. Patty was like, no. Even if she wasn't already married and had 2 kids, she wasn't interested. Despite all of this, Ralph was very persistent and continued to pursue Patty. During one very disturbing instance, Ralph had offered Patty $50,000 for one of her eggs, and he'd have a surrogate carry their baby, although he'd rather it be Patty. Like, I'm sorry, that is enough. This was causing quite a strain on Patty's family, as you can imagine, and I think initially she had this friendship, if you want to call it that, with Ralph, and it had just continued for so long because Patty was just very nice and polite and didn't want any conflict. Patty's husband Dan was not okay with this. I'm not okay with this. I understand not being intentionally rude to someone because you don't know what they might do or how they might react to this, but this is a completely unfair situation to put someone in, and it is totally okay to stand up for yourself. Ralph, you gotta go. Although Patty was seemingly able to cut ties with Ralph, the same could not be said for Nick. He had a friendship with Ralph that had continued, and Ralph had even described himself as Nick's godfather, which again is overstepping a boundary. Patty believes that Ralph had first befriended Nick in order to stay close with the family and continue being in their lives, even though he wasn't welcome. Patty believes that Ralph had planned to hurt Nick very early on. Ralph had been questioned early on in the case, and he had no knowledge of Nick's potential murder and claimed that he had an alibi for the night of the car accident. Ralph's ailing mother had claimed that he was home with her the entire time and had not left her home over the course of several days. Investigators were not so sure that he didn't have any involvement. Upon a search of Ralph's home, police found a scattering of paperwork all over the place, in particular on his desk. While rifling through it, they found what appeared to be insurance paperwork. A closer look at these documents proved to be copies of Nick's insurance policies. They also found the original that had been copied of the application to change one of the policy's beneficiaries. After looking through all these documents, investigators uncovered what they believed to be the plans to commit insurance fraud. It appeared that the two of them had made a plan to fake Nick's death in order to collect several sizable insurance payouts and go to South America and live off of the settlement. At this point, this was all only speculation, but the more time that passed, the more reasonable it seemed. Although the police didn't have proof that Ralph murdered Nick, it was later revealed that Nick had actually told his sister that he planned to change his life insurance beneficiary. At first, she didn't believe him, but when she realized he was being serious and intending on making the beneficiary for his whole policy Ralph, she was shocked and in disbelief. Ralph had a history of gambling, and it is believed that he was somehow able to convince Nick that he'd be able to take this amount of money and somehow flip it tenfold. When police began looking into Ralph at this angle, they discovered that he had a history of defrauding the insurance companies. In one instance, he had intentionally set fire to a home he owned and collected a sizable payout from that. Shortly after that, he had also received a settlement from a stolen car and boat and was able to live off of those settlements for a while. There is still only speculation at this point that Ralph was involved and responsible for Nick's death, but police obtained a court order to search his garage, hoping to find any type of connection. On a high shelf in his garage, police did find a sealed bottle of motor oil, the exact same one that was found in Nick's trunk. They cross-referenced the lot number that was printed on the back with the one that was found in Nick's trunk to the one that was found in Ralph's garage, and it was a match. The likelihood of two bottles with the same lot number being found was very, very slim, meaning they had to have come from the same case. Ralph had to have been the one to place the bottle in Nick's car and put the bottle cap under the carburetor. But why? Police believe Ralph hatched this plan to get revenge for all those years of rejection from Patty. They believe he befriended Nick because he knew he was the only family member who would still talk to him. He knew from the beginning that he was going to hurt Nick because at one point he told Patty, "You should know what it feels like to lose a child." Like, what kind of thing is that to say? Is that a threat? He was somehow able to convince Nick to intentionally crash his car, and they had most likely spoken about committing insurance fraud, and Ralph made it seem like a foolproof plan, and they'd walk away with $1 million. However, Ralph had different plans. Police believe that on the night of Nick's death, Nick might have had second thoughts and might not have wanted to go through with the plan. Ralph couldn't let this happen. It is believed that at one point an argument ensued and Ralph overpowered Nick, knocking him to the ground and strangling him to the point of unconsciousness. Ralph then proceeded to throw Nick into the river, where he ultimately drowned a short time later. When he realized that Nick's glasses had fallen off during the struggle, he picked them up and bent them in half, and ended up throwing them into the floor of Nick's car when he rolled it into the river to make it seem like they had been knocked from his face as his head hit the steering wheel. Whether or not Nick was involved in the conspiracy of fraud, he certainly had no intention of actually dying. He loved his family and his friends and would never have left them willingly. You can also argue that an 18-year-old might not see things in the big picture and only see things in the right now, and the right now might have seemed like a good opportunity. After all, he did see Ralph as a friend and had trusted him before, and had no reason not to trust him now. Having all of this physical and circumstantial evidence, Ralph was then arrested and charged with Nick's murder. The trial began on October 5th, 1999. At the trial, the prosecution had showed evidence that Nick couldn't have been the one to drive his car into the river, and how Ralph had tampered with the car's carburetor in order to keep the car at a constant speed to send it into the river. They also showed how it was impossible for Nick's glasses to end up in the condition they were found in the event that he was the one driving. They described how Ralph had had this sinister plan from the beginning. He knew he was going to kill Nick, one way or another. The prosecution had alleged that Ralph and Nick had equal parts in planning to fake Nick's death for the purpose of collecting a life insurance payout, and had agreed to split the payout 50-50. Nick had trusted Ralph and had never thought he would hurt him. Nick was probably overcome by shock when Ralph had attacked him that night and was unable or unwilling to fight back. On that night in February, Ralph attacked and strangled Nick, throwing his body in the river, thinking he would be carried downstream and possibly never found. It was actually Ralph's brother Ron who gave him away. Their mother claimed that Ralph had been home and was taking care of her, but Ron had revealed that this wasn't true. It was also revealed that Ralph had sent his sister Cheryl a letter where he wrote instructions on what to say if and when the police came to ask questions. She said that she had since burned the letter, but it was then that she realized that Ralph was most likely involved in Nick's death. Ralph's defense had argued that Nick had lost control of his vehicle and drove off the road himself, and that Ralph had no way of tampering with it since it was due to Nick's negligence that he had had car trouble in the first place. It was also brought up that Nick had not slept in several days. Remember, in the message he left for Sam, he said he had been awake for 32 hours. They claimed that it was his drowsiness that was the cause of him losing control behind the wheel. Ralph ended up taking the stand in his own defense, but this ended up being a mistake on his part. Big mistake. Huge. He was then questioned about the previous fraud he had committed and proved he had a history of planning and executing large-scale insurance fraud. Ralph insisted that he was innocent, but the jury did not buy this. And on January 13th, 2000, Ralph Marcus was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ralph was up for parole in 2011, but he lost the appeal. Ralph is currently incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, where he still has no chance of parole. This was such a heartbreaking story about a young man who really had his whole life ahead of him. It was all taken away because of Ralph's greed. Always try to use your very best judgment, and if anyone approaches you with a scheme to fake your own death in order to receive an insurance payout, just say no. It's never worth your safety. Be careful, be safe, and exhibit good judgment. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Ralph, you gotta go.